Today we're going to be doing a wrap-up of the books I read in September. So if you want any of these books, you can check them out in the description down below from bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is a company that works with small and local bookstops to give them a little bit of extra money when you buy stuff on bookshop.org. And they work with bookshops, not bookstops. I don't know what that is. So check them out in the description down below. Alternatively, try and pick up these books from your local library. So we're going to be doing a wrap-up from September, and it's weird because I've not done a wrap-up in a long time, but they're perfect Wednesday upload fodder. So I'm just going to talk through the books that I read in September. I think I read 2 extra books than I spoke about in my TBR. Actually, it's 1.5 because I'm halfway through one of the books I added additionally, which is really great for me because it's definitely not difficult to read so many books in a month. Anyway, let's get started. We're starting off with Earthsea, the first book in the Earthsea 6-book series. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm hoping by Christmas time I'm going to have a whole video just on the Earthsea books, or maybe a couple of videos on the Earthsea books, to be honest, because I got to milk that baby. But getting into it, Earthsea, I enjoyed it. I really liked it. I liked that it felt like this is a fantasy novel. The world building was spectacular. Le Guin obviously knew what she was doing, clearly, and that's why all the modern fantasy authors love Le Guin. And you know why when people compare Earthsea to Harry Potter, I'm a bit like, well, actually, one of them is great and the other one's Harry Potter. So honestly, highly recommend it if you're a fantasy fan and you've not read it. I obviously got into fantasy very recently, if you check out my videos above about me talking about my newfound perspective on fantasy literature. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was definitely felt like it was a book, I believe, written in the 60s. So it definitely felt like it was a book of the time, the language. It did feel a little bit like, to be honest, the language felt less modern. Again, comparing it to something like Harry Potter or even Eragon, where the language is still a little bit modern compared to like Le Guin, who obviously is trying to get that almost medieval feeling in the writing. You can kind of feel it coming through, and that's like a weird way of putting it because it's not medieval English. It's just, it feels old. Like Tolkien books feel old. And you can still find books written around the time Tolkien was writing that don't feel old. And you can do the same with Le Guin. You can find books from the 60s that feel very modern, but this feels like it rightfully fits in this sort of setting. But I'm not going to go too much into it. I'm not going to talk about the plot because I want to cover that in my actual video on the Earthsea books. So yeah, definitely check out Earthsea if you haven't. You probably have, because who reads fantasy books and hasn't read Earthsea? This guy, but I digress. The second book is a return of our favourite white boy, William Dalrymple, The Return of a King. So this book is basically about Britain's attempt to maybe not colonise, but influence Afghanistan in the early 19th century. Again, we love William Dalrymple here. You White Boy is basically our staple for William Dalrymple. But this book, again, really interesting, really great. Most of the other Dalrymple books I have read have been almost completely centered around India, mostly around Delhi. So it's really interesting to get his perspective and his understanding on Afghanistan. I also like at the end and the beginning, he kind of talks about his process in learning about Afghanistan, educating himself a bit more, how he's collecting his materials for writing this book. Really interesting perspective and really interesting stories about how he went about it. Very informative book. As always, the way Dalrymple writes is just super engaging. He writes non-fiction in a way that engages someone like me who really struggles with non-fiction, which is funny because half of these books here are non-fiction, but I struggle with non-fiction quite a bit. So the way he writes it is really interesting and it draws you in. It feels like a story. It's a very, very engaging way to write about non-fiction. I highly recommend it. Again, most of his other books are about like Delhi and the Mughals and India, or at least the ones I've read. Obviously, he's written so many books, to be honest. That William Dalrymple ranking video, that's gonna take a while, but you know, hopefully end of the year or beginning of next year. So really super interesting reads from him. I highly recommend it, especially if you want something slightly different. You want to know a little bit more about the history of Afghanistan and Britain's attempts to colonize Afghanistan in the past. It wasn't necessarily to colonize. It's a discussion they have within the book, whether Britain was trying to colonize Afghanistan or simply influence it to make it easier for them to have trade and you know, with the French and the Russians. It's a whole... History's a mess, what can I say? But, you know, our favourite white boy, William Dalrymple, banger. Next up is a book that wasn't on my TBR. It is The Biggest Prison on Earth by Ilan Pappé. It's basically Pappé describing and explaining how Israel has gone about basically turning Palestine into a prison, both in Gaza and the West Bank. The different methods they've gone about trying to control the populations in both areas and to colonize them. It's a frustrating read, not because of Pappé, but because of what he's telling us about, because you understand the things he is talking about, how Israel goes about their colonization of Gaza and the West Bank, and their complete control of the people in Gaza and the West Bank is still happening today. And the very fact that it is well known how Israel goes about controlling these areas of land and treating them like open air or maximum security prisons, and how our governments do not talk anything about it. I mean, David Cameron in the past has called Gaza an open air prison, but now the Tory party in their leadership debate is fighting over who loves Israel more, and Keir Starmer's like, I love Israel, boys, and David Lammy's like, oh guys, that stuff I said about Palestine, forget that, I love Israel too. Don't get me started on US politics, man. Don't get me started on the presidential election. If you want to hear more about my politics, you can check out my politics channel somewhere here and there. That's a good plug, actually. You should like and subscribe to this video and channel as well. But anyway, it is it is like a book on Palestine you should read. I think obviously it's Ilan Pappé, so I can't recommend Ilan Pappé's writing more. He is, if you want to learn about Palestine, if you want to read books about Palestine, you should always read the Ilan Pappé books. Just the fourth book, I think, is Bloody Nasty People, which is about the BNP. I thought this book was quite a good read. It was an interesting read. You know, my Goodreads review was, I wish all BNP members of Very Happy die. But it just tells you about the discrimination of the BNP, how people took very clear circumstances that were not caused by people of colour and blamed it on people of colour because they were easy scapegoats, which isn't a surprise, because that's exactly what's happening right now. You know, you can trace back all the problems that people often face in our countries, I'm talking about Britain specifically, to poor government policy, austerity, corruption, cronyism, and then people very easily blame people of colour because it's easier to blame a person who doesn't look like you than to rightfully blame a system, because the system of capitalism, the system of cronyism, you know, the system of corruption built into our government is a lot harder to point at and be like, that system is the reason nothing works. The fact that corporations are exploiting us, it's difficult to see the physical manifestation of that. Well, you see it in the poverty we see in this country, but it's far easier to look at a person who looks like me and be like, no, they are taking my job, or they are taking benefits, which makes it harder for me, because you don't really see reporting about how corporations, you know, avoid their taxes very often, and that plays back into the media and how in Britain the media prefers to scapegoat people than corporations, because also the media is a for-profit business and they want to make money anyway, and it's a whole convoluted thing. That's not discussed in this book. That book is more about the BNP, and again, it's a book that frustrates you, especially if you're a person of color, but the conclusion that like the far right has died that it kind of comes to at the end of the book, although it doesn't necessarily say that, it does still say by the end of the book, you know, there's still people who feel the way the BNP was speaking their rhetoric. And I feel like if this book basically covers up until 10, 12 years ago, I think if it continued, you would see the exact same stuff that's been covered in this book is the exact same stuff being said, just by different people, just by people who are more media savvy, just by people who are slightly better speakers than some of the BNP politicians. Next is Darfur, A New History of a Long War. This book is about Sudan and about kind of the war in Sudan and the not even war, just the conflicts going on in Sudan. It is very heavy, both in its research and also in its topics being covered, just from the offset. It is a difficult read, again, both in its content and also just the amount of information covered, especially if you're someone coming into this completely new. I took about over 2 weeks to get through this, and even then I finished it and I was like, I need to read this again, or at least I need to go through it again and start like underlining and marking off key points, because it is such a long and complicated circumstance. Obviously, maybe to people who are aware of Sudanese history and Sudanese politics, it's probably not. It's probably the same as with me, where I have a deep understanding of British politics because I studied it for so many years, but I don't have that when it comes to Sudan, so I have to just learn everything out of this book and then go away and then try and connect all the dots and look further. And it also covers like ethnic history in Sudan and religious history, so very dense. It's not a long book, so it's very dense. There's a lot of information in the 270 something pages, so it's definitely one where it's a key book because you're trying to learn all about places like Sudan, and also books on Sudan aren't super accessible. I think I made the video about it at the beginning of this year, and this was the only one I was able to get my hands on because the other ones were kind of prohibitively expensive, and I'm sure I could get a PDF somewhere, but it is difficult to get your hands on these sort of books. They are all very academic books, so I recommend it, especially if you're interested, and maybe if you're smarter than me, because I'm a little bit of a dum-dum. So if you're more educated than me, or you find it easier to read non-fiction than me, you'll probably get more out of this book than I did on my first read. But it is definitely a come back and read this book 2-3 times, or at least read it once, and then, you know, like if you were in university, you'd go through them like, this is key, etc, etc. So, and as an additional bonus, I'll throw in the book I'm reading at the moment. It is Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson. I'm hoping to have finished this by the time this video goes out. I might not be able to, it depends. I'm in like the final third of the book. So basically, I think I did a short on this, so you can click that somewhere if I can put it on the screen. But it is not Cedric Robinson basically being like, Marx, no, I got a new version of Marxism, but it's basically him talking about, one, how Marxism wasn't applied proper, or hasn't really been applied, and this book was written I think in the 70s or 80s, wasn't super well applied to like race. So some Marxist thinkers at the time weren't applying race and the concept of race to Marxism, and how that impacts, you know, society, how that can change or, you know, have a slightly different analysis of Marxism. Furthermore, he also talks about kind of race in context with capitalism, and sort of how, you know, the experience of race molds these black radicals, people like Du Bois and C.L.R. James, who I also love his writing, and how their experience as black people, but not necessarily just black people, this can basically be applied to non-white and non-European people, but how their experiences as well can inform their radical or their Marxist radical approach to thinking. That, you know, you can see, you know, Marx's and Engels' analysis of the working class, but also you need to throw in the fact that the black working class are affected differently because they are also marginalized further from, say, the white working class in America, and how, like, the black petty bourgeoisie is also exploitative of the black working class, but also they are exploited by the white petite bourgeoisie and the white bourgeoisie, and also even looked down upon by the white working class. And also, like, the effects of slavery in the Americas and how that kind of created the perception of black people in America, and how that influences their exploitation, which is also something that maybe Marxist analysis at the time wasn't looking at as well. You even now still see some Marxists, mostly like chronically online Marxists, who are like, race, you don't need to consider that when you think about your analysis of stuff. And I'm like, oh, your praxis does not, you know, look at how race is affected. Okay, sure, okay, yeah. But obviously I just waffled for a few minutes there. I've not finished the book, obviously, so I still need to finish it and kind of come to my conclusions into it. Again, feels like a book that you should come back to and read several times. Angela Davis recommends the book, so, you know, if Angela Davis says you should read it, I think you should read it. Although people are not infallible, I want to note that, because I think oftentimes when I talk about people, sometimes I talk about them in a way where I'm thinking they're infallible. Like when I talk about even our favourite white boy, William, I'm sure he's not infallible either. So just, I'm going to make a point in stopping talking about people as if they are infallible in my eyes. But with all that waffle said, I am obviously a little bit high on flu medication, but that was the Wednesday wrap-up video for September. Oh my god, that was longer than I expected. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about any of these books. Have you read any of them? What did you read in September? And yeah, looking forward to you guys seeing this video and seeing the video that was meant to come out today, but I've pushed to later because I think I'd do better at a later date. Like, subscribe, share the video with a friend or family member. And hey, I hope you read a great book today. Meow.